The Kesh auction station smelled like burnt metal and old fear. It always did on the last day of the sale, when the good stock was gone and only the leftovers remained. Buyers called this part of the day the discard block. Nobody dressed up for it. Nobody brought cameras or drinks. The rich traders had already left with their prize workers hours ago, and what stayed behind on the stage were the ones nobody wanted. The station itself was old, older than most of the traders who worked it. Kesh had been built during a mining boom 3 centuries back, a spinning ring of docks and warehouses wrapped around a dead moon, and somewhere along the way it had turned into one of the busiest slave and labor markets in this arm of Dominion space. Nobody called it that out loud. The signs above the docking bays said Kesh Trade Authority, Licensed Labor Exchange, all very official, all very clean. But everyone who walked those halls knew what actually happened here. Bodies changed hands. Some of them still had minds inside them that understood exactly what was happening, and that was the part most buyers tried very hard not to think about. The good stock sold in the morning, when the lighting was bright and the buyers wore their best clothes and the auctioneers used words like specimen and prime condition. By the time the sun lamps dimmed toward the station's fake evening, only the discard block remained, and the mood on the floor changed with it. Fewer buyers, worse lighting. Guards who didn't bother standing up straight anymore because nobody important was watching. Dorian Vale walked into that room at the exact moment the auctioneer was laughing at his own joke. He was human, and humans were rare this far out from Saul, rare enough that a dozen heads turned when the door hissed open. A Kesarine trader with 4 arms folded 2 of them across his chest and muttered something to his neighbor. A pale, insect-eyed buyer from the mining guilds didn't even look up from his data pad. Humans had a reputation out here, and it was not a good one. Soft skin, short lives, no claws, no venom, no natural armor. The kind of species that other species assumed had gotten lucky rather than earned anything. Dorian didn't care what they thought. He found a spot near the back wall, arms crossed, and watched the stage. The auctioneer was a Kesarine named Thrall, thin for his kind, with too many rings on his lower hands. He gestured at a cage on the platform where a slim, pale creature sat curled with its knees to its chest, silver eyes wide and wet. Lot 212, Thrall announced, voice bouncing off the metal walls. Viren stock, empath class. Unfortunately, this one is defective. He said the word the way some people said garbage. Cannot complete emotional suppression training, cries at the pain of others. Useless for combat work, useless for interrogation work, useless for anything requiring a spine. A ripple of laughter moved through the thin crowd. Opening bid, scrap price only. Someone take it before I have to process it myself. Dorian raised his hand. Thrall blinked all 3 of his eyes at once. You're bidding on the empath. I'm bidding on the empath. It's broken, human. It doesn't do anything. I heard you the first time. There was a pause. The kind that happens when a room isn't sure if it's watching something stupid or something interesting. Nobody else raised a bid. Dorian paid full trade price for a creature that Thrall had just called worthless, and the silver-eyed Viren in the cage looked at him like she didn't understand the words being said in her own language. Her name, Dorian would learn later, was Sable. A trader in the row ahead of him turned around. A heavy-set Gorn with tusks yellowed from age and looked Dorian up and down like he was trying to work out a joke he'd missed. You know that thing is going to cry every time you stub your toe, human. Every time you get a scratch. Every time anyone within 20 meters of it feels anything at all. It's not a pet. It's a leaking wound with legs. I know what it is, Dorian said. Then why? Because you called her a thing twice in one sentence, and she's sitting right there, and she can hear you. The Gorn blinked, glanced at the cage, and for the first time seemed to actually notice that the silver-eyed creature inside it was listening to every word, flinching a little smaller with each one. He didn't say anything else. He turned back around and didn't look at Dorian again for the rest of the auction, though Dorian noticed him glancing at the stage a little differently after that, like something small and uncomfortable had lodged itself under his skin. The next lot was worse. A Threxian stood chained at the wrists, easily 2 meters of muscle built for war, grown in a vat somewhere and trained from birth to end lives efficiently. His skin was the color of wet clay, scarred along one arm, and he stood with the kind of stillness that soldiers have when they've been taught that moving without permission gets you hurt. Threxian bio-soldier, Thrall said. Decommissioned. During a border action, this unit refused a direct order to eliminate non-combatants. Refused 3 times. His handlers tried to correct the behavior. It did not correct. Thrall tapped a stylus against his pad. A soldier who won't fight children isn't a soldier anymore. He's spare parts, organ harvest value only. The Threxian did not react to any of this. His eyes were fixed on some point past the crowd, past the walls, somewhere very far away. Dorian bid again. This time the whispers were louder. A Sill trader near the front actually laughed out loud. You bought the crier, now you're buying the coward too. He's not a coward, Dorian said, not raising his voice. He looked at a line and didn't cross it. That's the opposite of a coward. Nobody had an answer for that. Dorian paid, and the Threxian Corin, though Dorian didn't know his name yet, was led off the platform in chains that Dorian immediately asked to have removed. Lot 214 didn't move at all. It was small, gray, folded in on itself in the corner of its cage, limbs tucked so tightly it looked more like a stone than a person. Thrall didn't even bother with a full introduction. A Shan weave fragment, severed unit. You all know what that means, cut off from the hive mind, and once that link is gone, most of these just stop functioning. Doesn't eat unless forced, doesn't respond to stimulus. We've had it 4 cycles and it hasn't said one word. Not worth the cage space, honestly. Somebody take it off the station before I have to log it as a disposal. The room was quiet, not out of respect, just boredom. Nobody wanted a broken hive mind fragment. There was nothing to be done with a mind built to always be part of something larger, now alone for the first time in its existence. Dorian looked at the small gray shape a long moment. I'll take her. Her, Thrall repeated. It doesn't have a gender designation, human. It doesn't have anything. I'll take her, Dorian said again and put the credits down. Nobody in the cage had moved this whole time. But something in the corner of it, something small and gray and folded too tight, flinched at the sound of the word her, like it was the first time anyone had used it. Word of the strange human buyer had started spreading through the room by then, trader to trader in low voices. The way rumors always move faster than any official announcement. A few had pulled out their own data pads to check his registered name against trade databases, half expecting to find some large consortium hiding behind an ordinary face, a research contract, a hidden angle that would make sudden sense of all this. They found nothing. Just a man, a small independent ship, a modest trade license, no consortium backing at all. That unsettled them more than any conspiracy would have. A stranger with a secret plan was at least something the room understood. A stranger who simply meant what he said was not. By the 4th lot, the room had stopped laughing and started watching. The 4th lot was a Sill, a crystalline being whose kind grew slow and lived long, their bodies made of layered mineral instead of flesh, glowing faintly from some inner light that never fully went out even in the weak station lighting. But this one had a crack. It ran from the crown of her down through what would have been a chest on a fleshier species, a dark fault line through pale blue crystal, faint light leaking from it like a wound that wouldn't close. Sill crystal form, structural fracture core deep. These don't heal. This one has, by our estimate, 6 months before the crack reaches the resonance chamber and she stops functioning entirely. Thrall said it flatly, the way you describe a used part with a warranty about to expire. No practical use left in her. We were going to melt her down for raw material next week. If someone wants to pay for a temporary decoration instead, be my guest. The crystal woman didn't move, didn't speak. But there was something in the way the crack pulsed, faint and slow, like a held breath. How much for the temporary decoration, Dorian said. Thrall actually smiled at that one, the first real smile of the day. You're an odd human. How much? Just before the gavel fell, a second bidder raised a hand, a scrap dealer near the front, the same one who'd been eyeing Petra's cracked core with the look of a man doing quiet math about raw mineral weight. Wait, I'll match it. I can melt her down myself, save everyone the trouble of pretending there's a use for a dying crystal. The room went quiet in a different way this time. The kind of quiet that happens when even people who don't care very much realize they're listening to someone plan a person's death out loud like it was a matter of convenient logistics. Dorian didn't raise his voice. "I'll double it." The scrap dealer opened his mouth to counter, glanced at the number Dorian had just named, and closed it again. Nobody matched a bid that size for scrap value, and everyone in the room, including the dealer, understood exactly why not. Because Dorian wasn't buying scrap, and everyone was finally starting to notice the difference, even if none of them could explain what it meant yet. He paid it. Her name was Petra, and when the guards unlocked her cage, she looked at her own hands like she was checking to see if they were still there. The fifth lot was an old one, a dhole, a species built by their own culture for pure obedience, their entire history built around service to a ruling caste. This one had gray patches spreading across dark skin, hands soft from decades of paperwork instead of manual labor. Old for his kind. Slower than he used to be. Dhole record keeper. Refused a termination order regarding a family under his care. His caste doesn't tolerate that kind of failure. He's being sent for recycling at end of cycle regardless of what happens here today, so honestly this bid doesn't matter much either way. Something in Dorian's jaw tightened at the word recycling used for a living person, but his voice stayed level. "It matters to me." He bought Tam. The old dhole didn't look surprised. He looked like a man who had stopped expecting anything good a long time ago and wasn't sure what to do with the feeling now that something good had happened anyway. The last lot almost didn't happen at all. Thrall had already started rolling up his data pad when a guard dragged out a small, many-legged creature, barely reaching Dorian's knee, one of its 6 legs bent wrong and dragging. Labor stock mining division. Leg injury, can't work the tunnels anymore. Wasn't even going up for sale, we were just going to process it before shift change. Thrall looked almost embarrassed to be selling it. "You don't need to bid on this one, human." "It's not even on the list." "Put it on the list." Thrall stared at him. Then he shrugged, the universal gesture of someone who had given up trying to understand the day. "Your credits." The little creature, the guards just called him Bug, and the name stuck because nobody had ever bothered giving him a real one, looked up at Dorian with too many wide eyes and made a small clicking sound that might have been a question. "You're coming with me," Dorian told him, crouching down so they were closer to eye level. "Nobody's putting you in a mine tunnel again." By the time Dorian walked off the discard block, he had spent more credits than most buyers spent on an entire crew of prime, healthy, fully trained workers. He had bought a telepath who couldn't stop crying, a soldier who wouldn't kill, a hive mind fragment who didn't speak, a crystal woman who was dying, an old man scheduled for recycling, and an injured mining creature nobody had even planned to sell. He had bought, in other words, 6 lives that the rest of the galaxy had already decided were worth nothing. Speaker Voss, the station's owner, watched the whole thing from the observation deck above the auction floor, arms folded behind his back, his 4 black eyes narrowed in something between curiosity and suspicion. "That's the 4th cycle he's shown up," said the aide standing beside him. "Always the last day, always the discard block, always the defectives." "I know," Voss said quietly. "You think he knows something, a market angle we're missing, some buyer out there paying premium for broken goods." Voss didn't answer right away. He was watching the human on the floor below, watching the way the small mining creature had latched onto his leg and the way the human hadn't shaken it off, hadn't even seemed to notice it as an inconvenience at all. "I don't know what he's doing," Voss admitted, "but I intend to find out. Nobody spends that kind of money on garbage without a reason. Have someone follow his ship after departure, quietly." The aide hesitated before he left, then turned back. "There's a rumor going around the lower docks about defective stock. Some buyers out past the border worlds paying triple market rate for units with structural damage, neural anomalies, that sort of thing. Word is a few research consortiums think defects sometimes hide unusual properties, mutations, adaptations, things a healthy specimen would never develop." Voss's 4 eyes narrowed further. "You think the human is a broker for one of these consortiums?" "I think it's the only explanation that makes sense. Nobody pays full trade price for garbage out of kindness. There's no profit in kindness. The Dominion classification system exists for a reason, the aide added, almost defensive now, as if he could feel the ground shifting under a belief he'd never questioned before. Every species that joined the Dominion agreed to it. A unit that can't perform its designated function is a unit that costs more to maintain than it produces. That's not cruelty, Speaker, that's just arithmetic. I know the arithmetic, Voss said. I built half my fortune on it. He was quiet a moment, watching the empty auction floor below, the cages already being cleared for tomorrow's fresh stock. I only find myself wondering lately who decided what counts as a designated function in the first place. A species that can't stop feeling other people's pain gets called broken. A species built to feel nothing at all never does. I used to think that was simply how nature sorted itself. I'm no longer certain nature had anything to do with it. Voss said nothing further to that, though something about the phrase sat wrong with him in a way he couldn't quite name. He had run this station for 11 cycles. He had sold more lives than he could count and told himself for all of them that it was simply business, the same as selling ore or grain, numbers on a ledger and nothing more. It was easier that way. He had built an entire career on the comfortable idea that a defective unit was worth exactly what the market said it was worth, and not one credit more, because to believe otherwise was to admit that every disposal order he'd ever signed had been a mistake. Find out what he's doing with them, Voss said quietly. I want to know before anyone else does. Dorian didn't know any of this yet, of course. He only knew that he'd spent nearly every credit he had, that he had 6 strangers waiting for him at the docking bay who didn't trust him and had every reason not to, and that somewhere behind him on Kesh Station, a man who had never once in his life looked at a defective unit and seen a person was already deciding that Dorian's kindness was a business strategy he simply hadn't figured out yet. The ship was called the Second Chance, and it was smaller than Dorian would have liked for 6 new passengers, but it was home, and it was his, and nobody on it answered to anyone but him. He led them aboard one at a time, through a cargo bay he'd cleared out that morning and lined with blankets and crates turned into makeshift beds. Sable flinched at every sound. Corin stood at the door like he was still waiting for orders, shoulders squared, jaw tight. Nix, the little gray weave fragment, curled into the darkest corner of the room and didn't move. Petra stood very still and watched the ceiling lights like she'd never seen anything like them, which, Dorian realized, she probably hadn't. Sills didn't usually get to see much beyond the mines and the auction cages. Tam sat down slowly on a crate, hands folded, the posture of a man bracing for the next order. Bug pressed himself against Dorian's boot and refused to move from that spot for nearly an hour. I know this doesn't feel real yet, Dorian said, standing in the middle of the cargo bay, looking at 6 sets of eyes that ranged from terrified to hollow to simply too tired to feel anything at all. I know every single one of you is waiting for the part where this turns out to be another kind of cage. I'm not going to promise you it isn't, because promises don't mean much to people who have heard a lot of them broken. So I'm just going to tell you what's true, and you can believe it whenever you're ready to. He crouched down so he wasn't standing over anyone. You're not property anymore. Not to me, not on this ship, not anywhere in Dominion space as of the moment that payment cleared. That's not sentiment. That's actual law, even if most people don't bother reading it that far. You can walk off this ship at the next station we dock at, and I will not stop you and I will not chase you down. But if you stay, this is your home too, not mine that you're allowed to live in. Yours. Nobody said anything. Sable was crying quietly, the way Thrall had described as a defect, and Dorian didn't try to stop her. Corin's jaw worked like he wanted to speak but didn't trust himself to. Nyx didn't even lift her head from the corner. I'm not going to ask any of you to explain yourselves, Dorian went on. I'm not going to ask why the weave cut you loose, or why you wouldn't fight a war that told you to, or why your body's cracking, or why your leg won't heal right. I don't need the reason. I already know the only thing that matters. What's that? The voice was Corin's, low and rough, the first words he'd spoken since the auction floor. Dorian looked at him. That somebody decided you were done, and they were wrong. That night, ship night, artificial and quiet, the kind of dark that comes from turning down the lights rather than any real sun setting. Dorian sat alone in the cockpit reviewing supply manifests, and found himself thinking about a hospital bed a long time ago, and a doctor telling a room full of officers that the soldier in that bed would never serve again, not the way he used to, that his leg would never carry armor weight, that his hands would shake too much for combat work. He remembered the exact tone of voice, the same flat, bureaucratic tone Thrall had used on the auction floor. This unit is no longer combat effective. Somebody else back then had refused to accept that as the final word, had pulled strings, made calls, found him a different kind of work, told him that a body that couldn't fight anymore wasn't the same thing as a person who was finished. Dorian had never forgotten that. He'd promised himself in that hospital bed that if he ever got the chance to be the person who said no, this one still matters, he would take it. Her name had been Colonel Ray's, and she hadn't owed him anything. She had walked into that hospital ward on a routine visit, seen a young soldier staring at the ceiling with the particular emptiness of a man who had just been told his career was over at 26, and she had sat down on the edge of his bed without being asked and said, "So, what do you actually want to do with the rest of your life? Because I promise you it is not over just because the infantry doesn't want you anymore." He hadn't had an answer. Nobody had ever asked him that question and meant it before. Ray's had waited him out in silence for almost 10 minutes, patient as stone, until finally he'd said something small and half embarrassed about wanting to work with animals, maybe, on a ranch somewhere, something quiet. She hadn't laughed. She'd nodded like that was the most reasonable thing she'd heard all week, and 3 months later she'd found him a placement doing exactly that, on a reclamation ranch out past the colonies where broken-down machinery and injured livestock, and eventually, refugees from 3 different border conflicts all ended up living side by side because nobody else would take them. That ranch had taught him more than any hospital or any officer ever had. It had taught him that the word broken was almost always a lie told by people who had stopped looking closely enough to see what was actually there. A horse with a bad leg could still pull a smaller cart. A refugee with a limp could still teach a child to read. A machine with a cracked casing could still run for another decade if somebody bothered to check instead of assuming. The only thing that made something truly finished was a person deciding not to look anymore. He hadn't expected the chance to come wearing so many strange shapes, out here on a station 3 jumps from anywhere that had ever heard of Colonel Ray's or the ranch or a young soldier who had once believed his life was over at 26. But here it was anyway, sitting in cages, waiting to be told they still mattered. A soft chime interrupted his thoughts, a proximity alert, distant, nothing urgent yet, just a ship on long-range scan matching course, a full system behind them. Probably nothing. Dorian noted it, filed it, and went back to his manifests. He didn't know yet that Speaker Voss's man was already 3 jumps into following him, or that the report being filed back on Kesh Station described his cargo not as 6 free individuals starting a new life, but as unregistered defective units of undetermined value. He didn't know that somebody in the Dominion's enforcement office was about to read that report and get very interested indeed. Over the following days, the second chance settled into something that almost resembled quiet. Sable stopped flinching at every footstep by the 3rd day, though she still couldn't be in a room where 2 people argued, even about something as small as which ration packs to eat first. The moment voices rose even slightly, her whole body would curl inward like she was bracing for a blow that never came. Dorian noticed, and made sure nobody on his ship ever needed to raise their voice about ration packs again. Corin took up a position by the main airlock without being asked and stayed there most hours of the day, the posture of a soldier standing guard, except there was nothing to guard against and nobody giving him that order. Dorian let him do it. Some habits took longer to unlearn than others, and Corin seemed to need the shape of a job even before he trusted there was a home underneath it. Nix didn't speak, didn't eat much. Spent most of her time in the darkest corner of the cargo bay, gray and small and still, the way a hive fragment does when the silence in its head is louder than anything that's ever happened to it before. Dorian left food near her without comment and didn't push, and on the fifth day noticed that the plate was empty and Nyx had moved 6 inches closer to the light. Petra stood at the small viewport in the common area for hours at a time, watching the stars slide past, the crack down her chest pulsing very faintly whenever the ship passed near anything with a strong gravity well, like her broken crystal core was somehow still listening to the universe even as it failed. Dorian didn't understand what that meant yet. He would, eventually. Everyone on this ship would. Tam made himself useful in the galley, small quiet tasks, folding cloth, organizing supplies, the careful work of a record keeper who had spent his whole life being useful to people who never once said thank you. Dorian said thank you, every single time. He watched the old doll's shoulders come down a little more each time he heard it. Bug followed Dorian everywhere, slept outside his door, learned the sound of his footsteps and would come running, dragging, his bent legs still healing the moment he heard them in the corridor. On the fourth night, Dorian found Sable sitting alone by the small viewport in the common room, knees pulled up to her chest, the exact posture she'd held in her cage back on Kesh. He didn't say anything at first, just sat down a respectful distance away and looked out at the same stars she was looking at. "You don't have to talk," he said eventually. "I just didn't want you sitting here by yourself." "Why did you buy me?" she asked, so quietly he almost missed it. "Thrall told everyone I was useless, that I couldn't be trained, that I was a mistake in whatever process makes Virans the way they're supposed to be." Dorian thought about the question for a moment before answering, because he wanted to get it right. "Where I come from, there used to be dogs bred to guard livestock. Big animals bred over generations to be fierce and loyal and nothing else. And every so often one would be born that couldn't stand to see any creature suffer, not even the wolves they were supposed to fight off. The breeders called those ones failures, soft, wrong. What happened to them? Some people threw them away, same as your people did to you. But some people figured out that a guard dog too gentle to fight a wolf was still smart enough and loyal enough to do 100 other jobs nobody else could do half as well. Comfort dogs, search and rescue, reading to scared children in hospitals. The softness that made them fail at one thing made them extraordinary at everything else." He looked at her. "You feel everyone's pain like it's your own. Your people called that a defect because it made you bad at hurting others. I don't see how that's a flaw in anyone." Sable didn't answer, but she didn't move away from him either, and when he left an hour later, she was still sitting by the window, and for the first time since the auction, her shoulders weren't shaking. Corin took longer. The old soldier answered questions in single words if he answered at all, and spent his off hours running through combat forms in the empty cargo bay, alone, methodical, like a machine that didn't know how to stop even with nobody left to give it orders. Dorian watched him for 3 days before finally walking into the bay during one of these sessions and simply standing at the edge of it, arms crossed, saying nothing. Corin stopped mid-motion. "You want something. Just watching. Why?" "Because you move like someone who spent his whole life being told exactly what his body is for, and I'm curious what happens when nobody's telling you that anymore." Corin lowered his fist slowly. "I don't know what else to do with it. You don't have to know yet, but for what it's worth, refusing to kill children isn't a malfunction, Corin. Every culture I've ever heard of, mine included, has a word for someone who does that. We call them good." The big Threxian's jaw worked for a long moment, like he was chewing on a thought too large to swallow whole. "My handlers called it corrupted directive." "Your handlers were wrong about a lot of things. That was just the first one anybody caught." It was the longest conversation they'd had, and it ended with Corin simply nodding once, sharp and small, and going back to his forms. Though Dorian noticed the movements after that were a little less like a man practicing for a war that no longer existed, and a little more like a man just moving because it felt good to move. Nyx was the hardest. On the 6th day, Dorian brought a data slate into the cargo bay and sat down near her corner, close enough to be present, far enough not to crowd her, and simply started talking about nothing in particular. The ship's systems. A story about a mechanical failure he'd once fixed with nothing but wire and stubbornness. small, unimportant things that didn't require any response. He did this every day for a week before Nix finally spoke. "Why?" she said, the word cracked and unused, like a door opening on hinges that hadn't moved in years. "Why what? Why do you keep talking? I don't answer." Dorian looked over at her, small and gray, curled just slightly less tightly than she had been a week ago. "Because I figure it's been a long time since anyone talked to you like you were still in there. I didn't want to add to the silence." Nix didn't say anything else that night. But 2 nights later, when Dorian sat down in his usual spot and started talking about nothing again, she moved just slightly, just a few inches closer to where he sat and closer to the light. Petra's healing, if that was even the word for it, showed itself differently. She still stood at the viewport for hours, but Dorian noticed the crack down her chest had begun to pulse in time with something, a rhythm he couldn't place until Tam, of all people, pointed out quietly one evening that it matched the rhythm of the ship's engine hum, slow and steady, like her broken core had found something steady to listen to, and was matching its own damaged beat against it instead of fraying further apart. Whether that meant healing or just a slower kind of ending, none of them knew yet. But it was something to hold on to, and on a ship full of people who had been told they were finished, something to hold on to mattered more than most people understood. It wasn't a crew yet. Not really. It was 6 strangers and 1 human on a small ship, all of them still waiting to see if this was really different or just a slower kind of the same old thing. But it was something. And on a ship that small, something was already more than any of them had been given in a long time. Tam, meanwhile, had quietly appointed himself the ship's record keeper without anyone asking, the same role he'd held for decades among his own people, before one act of conscience had ended that career. He kept a small log of supplies, of names, of small things worth remembering. The day Nix spoke her first word, the day Corin stopped sleeping with his back against the wall like he still expected an attack from behind. Dorian found the log by accident one afternoon and asked him about it. "Old habit," Tam said, not looking up from the page. "Somebody should remember that these days happened. Where I come from, nothing was ever written down about a life unless it served the caste above it. I always thought that was wrong. People deserve to have their good days counted somewhere, not just their failures." "You were sentenced to recycling for refusing an order," Dorian said. "Can I ask what the order was?" Tam's hands went still over the page. "A family I had served for 30 years. Their youngest was born with a weakness in his legs, would never walk without help. The caste ruling was that such children should not be permitted to reach adulthood, that it was a mercy, that it was efficient. I was ordered to see it done quietly, and I was very good at doing things quietly for 30 years, and for the first time in my life I said no." He finally looked up. "I do not regret it. I would rather be recycled 1,000 times than be the kind of man who could do that and still call himself a record keeper of anything worth remembering." Bug, for his part, needed no long conversation to settle in. He simply attached himself to Dorian's daily routine the way a much smaller animal attaches itself to warmth, following him from cockpit to galley to cargo bay, clicking happily whenever Dorian scratched the ridge behind his head plates, and by the end of the first week had taken to sleeping curled directly across the threshold of Dorian's quarters, small and content, his once injured leg healing straighter every day under the ship's medical unit's slow attention. He didn't need philosophy or history to understand what had happened to him. He understood simply that the hands that used to hurt him were gone, and the hands that remained were kind, and that was enough. On the 7th day, the proximity alert changed tone. Dorian was in the cockpit when it happened, a sharper chime this time, the kind that meant a ship had shifted from matching course to closing distance, deliberately with intent. He pulled up the scan. A Dominion enforcement corvette, 3 times the mass of the Second Chance, running an intercept vector that would put it alongside his hull within the hour. He sat back in his chair and looked at the reading for a long moment. A Dominion corvette didn't run an intercept vector on a random trade vessel without cause, and Dorian's stomach had already worked out the most likely cause before his mind caught up to it. Somebody back on Kesh had gotten curious about the human who overpaid for garbage, and curious people with enforcement authority rarely stayed quiet about it. He pulled up the ship's registry paperwork out of habit, the bill of sale for 6 passengers now free under Dominion transfer law, the kind of document that should have settled any question before it was even asked. He hoped it would be enough. He had a feeling, sitting there in the low hum of the cockpit lights, that it might not be. Behind him in the corridor, he heard the soft scrape of Corin's footsteps. The old soldier had heard the change in the ship's tone too, some instinct from a life of combat drills that never fully switched off, and he was already moving toward the cockpit without having been called. "Trouble?" Corin asked from the doorway. Dorian looked at the reading one more time, then back at the Threxian standing in his doorway, a man the galaxy had called defective for refusing to hurt children, now standing quiet and ready in a doorway because he'd heard a change in engine tone from 2 rooms away and come to check if his new family was safe. "Might be," Dorian said. "Get everyone to the common room. I think it's time I told you all a little more about why I do this." Behind Corin, small and quiet, Nyx had come out of her corner for the first time in days and was standing in the corridor too, listening. The hail came through 30 minutes later, a clipped, official voice filling the cockpit speakers. "Independent vessel second chance. This is Dominion Enforcement Corvette HFY. Cut engines and prepare for inspection. You are carrying unregistered defective biological units in violation of station transfer protocol. Comply immediately." Dorian keyed the response channel, keeping his voice level even though his pulse was not. "HFY, this is second chance. My cargo is not unregistered. I have a completed bill of sale from Kesh Auction Station, full trade price paid, transfer of ownership finalized under Dominion Property Code, Section 11. I'm happy to transmit the paperwork." A pause. "Then, paperwork will be reviewed after boarding. Cut engines." By now the whole crew had gathered in the common room behind him, and Dorian didn't need to turn around to feel the shift in the air. Sable's breathing had gone shallow and fast. Corin stood with his arms loose at his sides in a way that meant he was anything but relaxed. Nyx had gone very still in the doorway, the particular stillness of prey deciding whether to run. Petra's crack had begun to pulse faster, brighter, matching some rhythm none of them could hear. Old Tam's hands were folded tight enough that his knuckles had gone pale. Bug had pressed himself against Dorian's boot and was making a low clicking sound that wasn't happy at all. "They can't take us back," Sable whispered. "Can they take us back?" Dorian turned in his chair to look at all of them. "Not if I have anything to say about it. And for what it's worth, I have paperwork, and I have a law that's on our side, even if somebody out there is hoping we don't know that. But I need you to trust me for the next hour, and I need you to trust each other, because I have a feeling we're all going to need everything each of us has." He cut engines. There was nothing else to do. Running would only confirm whatever suspicion had sent an enforcement corvette 3 times his ship's mass out here in the first place, and the second chance had no chance of outrunning a military hull anyway. The boarding party came through the airlock 4 strong, led by an officer whose uniform was crisp enough that Dorian suspected he rarely left dock duty. Behind the officer, 2 enforcement troopers held rifles in the low ready position, and a 4th figure, smaller, unarmed, wearing a station registrar's sash, carried a data pad and looked distinctly uncomfortable to be there at all. "Captain," the officer said, not quite a question, sizing Dorian up. "Lieutenant Casimir Drell, Dominion Enforcement. We have a report that this vessel is transporting defective biological units without proper decommission certification." "I have a bill of sale," Dorian said again, holding out a data slip. "Full and final transfer, 6 units, purchased at trade price from Kesh Auction Station 7 days ago. That's proper certification under Section 11. Drell took the slip but didn't look at it. His eyes were on the crew gathered in the common room instead, on Corin's broad shoulders, on the pale glow leaking from the crack down Petra's chest, on the small gray shape of Nyx pressed into the corner. Section 11 applies to standard property transfer. Defective units require a secondary disposal or research release form before private ownership is recognized. Did the auction house provide you with that form? Dorian's jaw tightened, because he understood exactly what was happening now. Somebody had told this officer to find a reason, any reason, and Section 11's fine print about disposal forms was thin enough to argue either way if you wanted to argue it that way badly enough. Nobody mentioned a secondary form, Dorian said carefully. I paid trade price, same as anyone buying a healthy unit. If the paperwork's incomplete, that's an error on the auction house's part, not grounds to seize 6 people who already have a bill of sale in their name. Sable, standing near the back of the room, had gone rigid, her silver eyes fixed on Lieutenant Drell with an intensity that made the officer glance her way uneasy. Something wrong with the empath? Drell asked. She's frightened, Dorian said. Most people are when armed strangers board their home. But Sable wasn't just frightened. She had gone still the way she did when a feeling hit her too hard to process quickly, and after a moment she looked at Dorian, and though she said nothing out loud, the look on her face said everything. He's lying. Somebody paid him to be here. He doesn't even believe what he's saying. Dorian caught the look and filed it away and kept his voice level. Lieutenant, I'd like to know who filed this report, and I'd like it noted for the record that I've cooperated fully and provided documentation at every step. That's not how this works, Drell said, and something in his tone had shifted, harder now, less procedural. Step aside. We'll be taking inventory of the defective units for reassessment. That was the moment Corin moved. Not toward the troopers. The old soldier had spent his entire existence being trained not to escalate, and some habits held even now. Instead he stepped, deliberately and without hurry, into the doorway between the boarding party and the rest of the crew, a wall of scarred gray muscle that didn't raise a fist or make a single threatening gesture. He simply stood there, arms crossed, immovable. You will not touch them, Corin said, quiet, flat, the voice of a man who had once refused a direct order rather than harm the innocent, and clearly intended to refuse this one too. One of the troopers raised his rifle half an inch. Dorian's heart lurched. Stand down, Drell snapped at the trooper, then turned back to Corin, sizing up 2 meters of decommissioned bio-soldier with the particular unease of a man realizing his weapons might not matter as much as he'd assumed. Threxian units are property regardless of certification status. Step aside or be reclassified as a hostile asset. I was reclassified once already, Corin said. Defective, they called me for refusing to kill children. I have made my peace with being called anything you like. I am still not moving. The room held its breath. And then, from the corner, a small clicking voice broke the silence. Nyx, stepping forward out of her corner for the first time since anyone but Dorian had seen her move on her own. They are not alone, she said, the words rough and slow, but clear. Neither am I. Something about a hive fragment who hadn't spoken in months choosing this exact moment to declare herself part of something again seemed to unsettle Lieutenant Drell more than Corin's wall of muscle had. He glanced at his registrar, the uncomfortable one holding the data pad. Run the ownership registry. Confirm the transfer. The registrar, a thin, nervous sill named Erevan, it would turn out, tapped through several screens, and his expression shifted from anxious to genuinely surprised. Sir, the transfer is confirmed. Full trade price, properly logged, 6 units, current owner Dorian Vale, no outstanding claims from Kesh Station or any registered consortium. He looked up. Sir, this transfer is entirely legal. I don't see any grounds for reassessment. Drell's expression flickered, and for one moment Dorian saw the truth underneath the crisp uniform. A man who had been sent out here on somebody's private errand, dressed up as procedure, and was now discovering the procedure didn't actually support him. There's still the matter of the structural defects, Drell tried, weaker now. Public safety concerns. A cracked sill core, a severed hive fragment, these units could become unstable. Petra, who had not said a single word since the auction floor, stepped forward then into the light, and the crack running down her crystal chest pulsed once, bright and steady. I have been unstable for 6 months, she said, her voice like glass chimes, slow and deliberate. I have not hurt anyone. I have not become anything except tired of people deciding what I am before they ask me. For a moment, nobody on either side moved. Lieutenant Drell looked at Corin's unmoving wall of muscle, at Petra glowing steady in the low light, at Nyx standing straighter than a severed hive fragment should have been able to stand. And Dorian could see the exact instant the officer realized this was not the frightened, disorganized cargo of broken units he had been told to expect. Whatever report had reached him back on Kesh had described 6 pieces of damaged property waiting to be reclaimed without resistance. What stood in front of him instead looked, for the first time in any of their lives, like something that could not easily be taken from anywhere. It was Tam who ended it, in the end, not with strength, not with a declaration, but with the quiet, patient skill of 30 years spent reading legal codes for a caste that had never once thanked him for it. "Lieutenant," the old dole said, stepping forward with his hands folded, unhurried, "may I see the report that authorized this boarding? Not the boarding order itself, the original complaint. I have some experience with Dominion property statutes, and I would like to see under which subsection this inspection was authorized." Drell hesitated, and that hesitation told Tam everything he needed to know. "That information is not required to be. It is, in fact, required," Tam said gently, "under Enforcement Procedure 9, which states that any boarding action targeting private property must cite the specific statute and complainant identity in the boarding log, precisely so that abuse of enforcement authority for private commercial disputes can be traced and prosecuted. I would be happy to recite the exact wording if it would help. I spent 30 years keeping records for a caste that insisted on that kind of precision, Lieutenant. It is, if nothing else, a skill I still have." The color drained slightly from Drell's face. Behind him, Irevan the registrar was already pulling up Enforcement Procedure 9 on his data pad, nodding slowly, confirming every word. "This complaint," Tam continued, still gentle, still patient, "was filed by a private commercial party, wasn't it? Not a Dominion office. Someone with a financial interest in seeing this transfer reversed. Nobody answered. Nobody needed to." Lieutenant Drell stood very still for a long moment, looking at 6 people the galaxy had called broken. A wall of quiet muscle that wouldn't move. A hive fragment who had chosen to belong to something again. A crystal woman standing in her own light. An old record keeper who knew the law better than the men enforcing it. A telepath who could read a lie the moment it formed. And a small many-legged creature pressed protectively against his owner's leg, clicking low and steady. And made the calculation that men who send other men to do dishonest work for them rarely thank the ones who get caught doing it. "Stand down," Drell said finally, to his own troopers, his voice flat. "We're leaving." Back on Kesh Station, Speaker Voss received the report of the failed boarding with the particular stillness of a man who has just watched a plan fall apart in front of witnesses. The registrar confirmed the transfer as legal, his aide reported, not quite meeting his 4 eyes. Lieutenant Drell was forced to stand down. There's already talk on the lower docks about it. Buyers asking why an enforcement corvette went after a properly documented purchase. "Then we handle it a different way," Voss said after a long moment. "Quietly this time. No uniforms, no paperwork, nothing with my name anywhere near it." "Sir, if you're suggesting—" "I'm not suggesting anything," Voss said, in the tone of a man who has decided long ago that plausible deniability was worth more than honesty ever could be. "I'm simply noting that the Ashgrel operate in that sector, and that Ashgrel captains have never once turned down a paying contract in the history of their existence. What happens after that is entirely their business." He told himself, as he placed the call, that this was still simply business. Numbers on a ledger. Nothing personal in it at all. It was easier that way. It had always been easier that way. He did not let himself think too hard about the fact that somewhere out past the border, 6 people who had finally been told they mattered were about to be reminded violently that not everyone agreed. They should have simply left it there. That was what Dorian told himself afterward, in the hours that followed, turning the whole encounter over in his mind. A tense hour, a legal victory, a corrupt officer sent home with his tail between his legs. It should have ended clean. It didn't. 6 hours after the Ashvin peeled away, a new set of proximity alerts lit up across every scanner on the Second Chance at once. Not 1 ship this time, but 4, closing fast from 2 directions, running dark, no registered transponder codes at all. Raiders. The kind that operated just outside Dominion patrol routes, hired quietly by people with money and grudges and no interest in doing their dirty work through official channels a second time. Ashgrel Raiders, Corin said grimly, reading the scan data over Dorian's shoulder. I trained against their tactics once. They don't take prisoners for ransom. They take cargo. Whatever's valuable they strip and everything else they space. Somebody's paying them to finish what the Corvette started, Dorian said, already pulling up evasive routing, though a small trade ship had few good options against 4 Raider hulls. Voss, it has to be. He couldn't get us through official channels, so now he's trying it dirty. Sable's hand found the edge of the console, knuckles white. What do we do? Dorian looked around the cockpit at the faces gathered there, every one of them people the galaxy had thrown away, none of them soldiers by choice, none of them equipped for a fight against professional raiders by any measure the Dominion would recognize as real strength. And yet, we do exactly what we've been doing, Dorian said. We stop believing what everyone else decided we were, and we use what we actually are instead. For one long moment, nobody moved. 6 people who had spent their whole lives being told, in one way or another, that they were the reason things went wrong, stood in a small cockpit staring at a scanner full of ships built specifically to hurt people like them, and Dorian watched the old fear try to settle back over all of them at once, the fear that said none of this matters. We are still exactly what they said we were. It was Corin who broke it, oddly enough, the quietest and least talkative of all of them. I refused an order once because I decided a line existed that I would not cross, even knowing what it would cost me. I am not interested in discovering, after all of that, that I would let 4 Raider ships take away the first home I have ever had without a fight. He looked around at the others. I do not know what the rest of you will do. I know what I am going to do. That seemed to settle something in the room, a decision made collectively without a single vote taken. The plan came together fast, out of necessity more than confidence, built from pieces that shouldn't have fit together at all. Nyx, still faintly tethered to echoes of the weave even after her severing, a connection the Ashan hive mind researchers had assumed was fully dead, but which flickered back to half-life now that she had chosen, on her own, to belong to something again, reached out through that thread and found the Raider formation's positioning almost by instinct, feeding it to Dorian in short, halting bursts of description. 4 ships, staggered, 2 ahead and 2 flanking wide to box them in. Petra pressed her palm flat against the ship's hull plating, and the crack down her chest hummed low, resonating with the second chance's own power conduits in a way no engineer had ever designed for, and no SIL researcher had ever documented, because no one had ever bothered studying what a dying, crystal form's broken core could actually do. Through that resonance, she found the Raider's shield frequencies, faint vibrations bleeding through vacuum and hull alike, and began, slowly, painstakingly, to hum a counter-frequency back. Sable closed her eyes and reached outward the way she'd been punished for doing her whole life, past politeness, past caution, into the minds of the nearest Raider crew. Not to control them, she couldn't do that even if she'd wanted to, but to feel them, and what she felt back was fear laced through with greed. Young crews hired cheap, and told this would be an easy strip and run against an unarmed trade ship. Not soldiers who wanted a real fight, men counting on easy prey. They're not ready for resistance, she said, eyes still closed. They think this is simple. If we make it not simple, some of them will break formation on their own. Corin was already moving toward the cargo bay, toward the manual override for the exterior loading clamps, an old combat instinct translating itself into the only weapon a decommissioned soldier without a single rifle on board actually had. Knowledge of exactly where a ship's hull was weakest, and exactly how to make an approaching boarding party think twice about using it. Tam sat at the secondary console and began transmitting, calm as ever, a data burst aimed at the nearest Dominion patrol relay. Not a distress call exactly, but a formal, precisely worded legal notice citing Enforcement Procedure 9 and naming speaker, Voss directly as the suspected commissioning party behind an unregistered raid on a vessel with confirmed legal title. The exact kind of bureaucratic landmine a lifetime of cast record keeping had taught him to plant with surgical precision. His hands did not shake as he typed, though everything around him was chaos. The ship rattling under near misses, alarms blaring in 3 different tones. 30 years of filing reports, nobody ever thanked him for had taught him something the raiders would never understand. That the right words, filed with the right citation, in the right office, could move faster and hit harder than any weapon this small trade ship carried. He had spent his whole life being underestimated for being merely a record keeper, a caste built for obedience and paperwork and nothing else. He intended, for once, to make that underestimation cost someone dearly. "Done," he said quietly, when the transmission confirmed delivery. "Now we simply need to survive long enough for someone to read it." And Bug, small and quick and far better suited to tight spaces than any of them, disappeared into the ship's maintenance crawlways with a spare tool kit clenched in his mandibles, working his way toward the external sensor housing to do the one thing none of the others could: physically disrupt the raiders' targeting lock from the outside, a job built for something small enough to move where nothing bigger could follow. The first raider ship broke off entirely 11 minutes into the encounter, its crew rattled by a counter-frequency screech bleeding through their own shields that Petra's crack had built note by resonant note. A sound Sable confirmed through half-formed impressions of raider minds as somewhere between deeply unpleasant and genuinely frightening, an unexplained malfunction their own sensors couldn't account for. Petra herself stood with both palms pressed flat against the cold hull plating the entire time, eyes closed, her whole crystal body trembling faintly with the effort, the crack along her chest blazing brighter than any of them had ever seen it. And when the first ship finally peeled away into the dark, she staggered and would have fallen if Tam hadn't caught her, murmuring something too quiet for the others to hear, something that sounded almost like thank you, in a voice too tired to be anything but sincere. The second stalled its approach when Bug's tampering sent its targeting solution, jumping erratically between 3 false contacts that didn't exist, buying the second chance nearly 4 full minutes of clean maneuvering room that Dorian used to put the ship's slim profile behind a drifting stretch of old mining debris, breaking 2 separate weapons locks in the process. The third ship pushed in close enough to attempt a boarding, magnetic clamps latching onto the outer hull with a shutter that ran through the whole ship, and it was Corin who met that boarding party at the airlock. Not with violence, though every one of them expected it, and every one of them had rifles raised and ready for it, but with the door simply refusing to open at all. Override locks engaged from the inside with the same methodical patience the big Threxian had once used to refuse an order to fire on children, standing immovable on the other side of a door that would not yield no matter how many charges they tried to set, buying time, always buying time, until the raiders' own sensors began flashing warnings about a Dominion patrol response vector that Tam's careful, precisely filed complaint had summoned faster than any of them expected. Dorian's hand stayed steady on the controls, but his mind, for just a moment, went back to that hospital bed again, to the flat voice telling him he was no longer combat effective, to how small and finished he had felt in that instant. He understood, watching his crew work around him now, each of them turning some old wound into the very thing keeping all of them alive, exactly why that memory kept surfacing tonight. He had spent years since then believing that Colonel Reyes had saved him by finding him something soft to do instead of something hard. He realized now, watching Corin hold a door shut with nothing but will and sable red fear off the surface of strangers' minds and Petra sing frequencies with a body everyone had called dying, that Reyes hadn't given him something soft at all. She had simply been the first person to notice that broken did not mean without a purpose, and that the purpose was often something no healthy, undamaged version of the same person would ever have found. The fourth ship was the one that mattered, the one carrying, Sable confirmed through the raw fear static of its crew's surface thoughts, the actual contract details, the actual name of the party who'd paid for all of this. That ship held its position longest, its captain clearly under direct orders not to retreat regardless of cost, and it was that ship's weapons officer who finally got a clean shot lined up on the second chance's engine housing. The shot never landed. Nyx, reaching through her half-healed thread of connection one last time, found the one thing a raider crew forced to work quickly and quietly could never fully hide from a mind built to read networks: the coordination lag between the fourth ship's targeting computer and its human gunner, a half-second gap that existed in every rushed, poorly maintained raider vessel in this sector, and she pushed that half-second into Dorian's awareness with a clarity that startled even her. "Now," she said. "Turn now." Dorian turned. The shot went wide, clipping nothing but empty vacuum, and in the half-second of confusion that followed, Tam's transmitted complaint bore its fruit at last. 3 Dominion patrol vessels, summoned by a formal legal notice naming Speaker Voss as the commissioning party behind an illegal raid, dropped out of transit exactly where the raiders' own retreat vector would have taken them. And the fourth ship, faced suddenly with a legitimate enforcement response, instead of the easy, deniable strip and run it had been promised, broke off and fled into the dark rather than be caught red-handed in a raid with a paper trail leading straight back to its employer. It was quiet for a long time afterward, the kind of quiet that comes after fear finally lets go of a body all at once, leaving everyone a little unsteady on their feet. Dorian found them all gathered in the common room an hour later, nobody quite ready to sleep yet, everyone still running on the last of whatever had carried them through. Sable sat with her knees pulled up but her shoulders loose, no longer bracing. Corin sat on the floor with his back against the wall, not out of old habit this time, but simply because he was tired, genuinely, comfortably tired, the way a person gets after doing something that mattered. Nyx sat closer to the center of the room than she ever had before. Petra's crack had gone quiet and steady, no longer pulsing with strain, simply glowing faint and warm like a lamp left on for comfort rather than necessity. Tam was writing something in his little log, a small smile on his face that Dorian hadn't seen there before. Bug lay curled against Dorian's side, exhausted, one leg, the once injured one, stretched out straight and strong. "We did that," Sable said quietly, like she still couldn't quite believe it. "All of us, together." "The things they call defects," Corin said, working it through slowly like a man solving a problem he'd carried for years. "My restraint, your empathy, Nyx's connection, Petra's crack, Tam's patience, Bug's size, every single thing they used as a reason to throw us away, was the exact thing that saved us tonight," Dorian finished. "Nobody who threw you out ever really looked closely enough to understand what they were losing. They just saw something that didn't fit the shape they wanted and decided that made it worthless. It never occurred to a single one of them that the shape they wanted might just be too small." Nyx, quiet Nyx, who had gone months without a single word before this ship, looked up at that. "You knew this would happen, that we would be enough." "I didn't know," Dorian admitted. "I hoped. There's a difference. But I've spent a long time watching people get written off by other people who never once bothered to find out what they were actually capable of, and every single time, without fail, the ones who got the chance to prove it wrong did exactly that." He looked around the room, at 6 faces that had started this week as strangers and were finishing it as something else entirely. "You didn't need me to save you tonight. I just opened a door. You did the rest yourselves." Word travels strangely out in the border systems, faster than any official channel, carried ship to ship by traders who like a good story more than they like keeping quiet about one. Within 2 cycles, half of Kesh Station had heard some version of the tale, the human who bought every broken thing on the discard block, and then held off a raider fleet with nothing but the very defects everyone had laughed at. Speaker Voss did not survive the scrutiny that followed. Tam's formal complaint, filed in the heat of the moment with a record-keeper's precision, had named him plainly, and the Dominion Patrol response that scattered the raiders had done so specifically because his name was already attached to the report. An investigation opened. Whatever else came of it, Voss never ran another auction on Kesh Station again. And for the first time in longer than anyone could remember, buyers on the discard block started asking auctioneers uncomfortable questions about exactly why a unit was labeled defective in the first place. Dorian's ship became something of a legend after that, not the kind with statues or songs, just the quiet, practical kind that spreads through people who need it most. A rumor passed cage to cage, cell to cell, that somewhere out past the border there was a human who didn't care what you'd been called, only what you might still become. More came to him after that, one at a time, sometimes two, always the ones nobody else wanted. The second chance grew too small within a year, and Dorian bought a bigger ship, and then eventually something closer to a small station of its own, a place with a name that stuck harder than any official designation ever could: the ranch. Sable eventually taught herself to use her empathy not as a wound, but as a bridge mediating disputes between new arrivals who didn't trust each other yet. The same gift that had once been called a defect, now the very thing that held the whole growing family together. Corin became the quiet backbone of every new arrival's first difficult week, the one who understood better than anyone what it meant to be told your body was only good for one thing, and then discover it was good for 100 others. Nyx, fully reconnected now to a network of her own choosing rather than one forced upon her at birth, helped coordinate the ranch's growing community with an ease that made outsiders assume she'd never been broken at all. Petra's crack never fully closed, but it never worsened either, and she came to see it not as a flaw to hide, but as a mark of everything she'd survived, glowing steady and warm at the center of the community she'd helped save. Tam kept his records, as he always had, only now every good day got written down as carefully as every hardship once had been. And Bug, well past the age most of his kind ever reached given the mines they usually died in, spent his days doing exactly what he wanted, for the first time in his life, which mostly meant staying close to the people he loved. 2 years after the raid, on a docking ring far busier and far friendlier than Kesh Station had ever been, Dorian stood at the base of a boarding ramp watching a new arrival hesitate at the top of it. A young Kessarine who'd been sold off by her own family for a birth defect in her lower arms, small and shaking, clearly certain that this was simply another cage wearing a friendlier face. Sable was the one who went to meet her first, the way she always did now, sitting down at a respectful distance the way Dorian once had with her, and saying nothing at all for a long while, just letting the girl feel that the fear in the room wasn't hers alone anymore. Corin stood nearby, arms loose, no longer a wall meant to intimidate but simply a presence meant to reassure, the shape of safety rather than threat. Nyx, coordinating a dozen small tasks across the growing station through a network she had built herself, one voluntary thread at a time, paused what she was doing to send the newcomer a single simple thought, warm and clear. You are not alone here, and you never will be again. Tam added the girl's name to his log that same evening, the first line in what would become, in time, pages and pages of good days finally being counted. Petra sat with her near the viewport, her crack glowing soft and steady, and told her in her slow, chiming voice that some of the strongest things in this galaxy were the ones that had already been broken once and decided to keep going anyway. Bug, now old for his kind but still quick, simply curled up against the newcomer's side and refused to leave, the same wordless welcome he'd once been given himself. Dorian watched from the bottom of the ramp and said nothing, because by now he didn't need to. The lesson had outgrown him. It belonged to all of them now, and it would keep belonging to whoever needed it next. None of them ever forgot the auction floor, or the words used to describe them there. But somewhere along the way, Defective had stopped feeling like the last word anyone would ever say about them, and started feeling like the beginning of a much longer story instead. It turned out, in the end, that the galaxy had been asking the wrong question all along. It had spent centuries asking what is wrong with this one, and thrown away everyone who failed to answer it neatly. Dorian had only ever asked one question in return, the same one Colonel Reyes had once asked him from the edge of a hospital bed, and it had been enough to change everything. What do you still have left to give? Every single time, without exception, the answer turned out to be more than anyone had bothered to imagine. Maybe that is the only real difference between a species that gets called great by the rest of the galaxy and one that quietly changes it forever. Not stronger claws, not thicker armor, not some rare gift no other species happens to carry. Just a stubborn refusal to believe that anyone ever is finished before they've been given the chance to prove otherwise. Somewhere out past the border, on a small ship that grew into something much larger, that refusal turned 6 discarded lives into a family nobody saw coming, and a family into a home, and a home into a promise that kept spreading, one rescued life at a time, further than a single human ever could have carried it alone. It started with an auction floor, a laughing auctioneer, and one quiet man who looked at everything the galaxy had already thrown away and simply said, "Not yet."